The trajectory of the United States from an isolationist entity to the arsenal of democracy was neither instantaneous nor singular, but rather a gradual, contentious, and often contradictory evolution, constrained by deeply held public opinion and restrictive legislative mandate. This inertia was compounded by the devastating Great Depression, which rigorously prioritized domestic recovery and budgetary austerity over foreign defense spending, keeping military expenditures at historically low peacetime levels throughout the 1930s. The psychological and professional impact of this budgetary starvation on the military establishment was profound. Officers faced widespread obsolescence in training, doctrines, and equipment, and strategic planning was routinely restricted to defending the coastal perimeters of the continental United States and its extant territories, including the Panama Canal and certain Pacific possessions. Pre-war planning, encapsulated in the non-implemented Rainbow Plans, generally assumed protracted defensive campaigns rather than projecting power overseas, highlighting the defensive inertia of the General Staff. The strategic focus of the Navy remained dangerously confined by the quantitative and qualitative restrictions imposed by the Washington and London naval treaties, resulting in an aging and geographically dispersed fleet whose technological parity with potential adversaries was rapidly declining. The political leadership, conditioned by decades of non-interventionist dogma, fundamentally misunderstood the speed and mobility of modern mechanized warfare, often relying on obsolete concepts of static defense, a profound failure of foresight that subsequent events rendered painfully apparent. In late 1939, the nation presented a profound strategic paradox. While possessing an industrial and natural resource base that demonstrably exceeded the aggregated capacity of all Axis powers, its actual military readiness was characterized by significant atrophy, structural deficiencies, and doctrinal obsolescence within its senior military formations. The United States Army, comprising a mere complement of fewer than 200,000 active duty personnel, maintained a rank approximately 17th globally, a force comparable in size and preparedness to the standing armies of minor European powers such as Portugal or Bulgaria. Operational doctrine remained conceptually mired in the static, positional warfare ethos of the First World War, retaining a significant and anachronistic reliance on equestrian cavalry units. The severe material deficits endemic to the armed forces were starkly illuminated during the Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, a massive, large-scale training exercise designed specifically to test the nation's capacity for rapid mobilization and deployment against a modern foe. The acute paucity of modern mechanized armaments necessitated the pervasive utilization of improvised equipment, such as commercial trucks designated as tanks, wooden replicas substituting for machine guns, and stovepipes simulating mortar artillery. This infamous broomstick army, operating with surrogate equipment and outdated tactics, served to highlight a critical and undeniable vulnerability in national security planning. For instance, the most advanced American tank available, the M2 light tank, was vastly inferior in armament, equipped with a meager 37mm gun, armor protection, possessing only thin plating, and operational mobility to the German Panzer models already in decisive operational use across Europe, possessing only thin plating and marginal cross-country capability. Furthermore, crucial new technologies such as airborne radar and modern anti-aircraft artillery, AAA, were almost wholly absent from the inventory, forcing reliance on outdated searchlights and less effective weaponry, specifically the obsolete French 75mm field gun dating from World War I. This state of affairs extended to troop deployment capabilities. The Army possessed negligible dedicated air transport capacity, rendering any rapid, large-scale intervention overseas virtually impossible. a limitation acutely felt by military planners observing German airborne operations. While the Wehrmacht had decisively demonstrated the devastating efficacy of integrated blitzkrieg tactics, a system predicated upon rapid, synchronized advances of mechanized armor and air superiority in campaigns across Poland and France, the United States possessed not a single fully equipped, combat-ready armored division, nor the required specialized logistical infrastructure to sustain one overseas. This pronounced disparity between American economic potential, latent power, and its operational military kinetic capability constituted a dangerous and potentially catastrophic strategic gap. The critical lack of a robust domestic munitions industry, particularly concerning the volume production of modern artillery shells, high-speed machine tools necessary for precision manufacturing, and specialized aviation alloys, further compounded these deficiencies, rendering rapid rearmament a formidable logistical challenge that demanded a complete and immediate national industrial retooling. This structural weakness was underpinned by the nearly two-decade hiatus in large-scale military contracting since 1918, which prevented the maintenance of skilled labor pools and modern tooling across the heavy manufacturing sector, necessitating the construction of entirely new defense facilities, shadow factories, when mobilization finally began. The failure to maintain a production base capable of switching quickly from peacetime goods, automobiles, to wartime materiel, tanks and planes, was perhaps the greatest single industrial liability inherited from the isolationist era, requiring the costly and time-consuming scrapping of existing production templates. The Joint Army-Navy Munitions Board, ANNB, was severely understaffed and lacked the necessary statutory authority to enforce conversion orders across the fragmented private industrial landscape, revealing a deep flaw in the national defense planning apparatus. The Army's primary strategic focus remained anchored in defending Latin America, a mission codified under the obsolete War Plan Orange framework, even as the European danger intensified. The prevailing military ethos was one of reactive defense, profoundly inadequate for the global offensive commitments that would ultimately be required, demanding an abrupt philosophical and logistical shift. This enduring state of military unpreparedness was the direct and intended consequence of the prevailing political and legislative climate established during the interwar years, rooted deeply in historical trauma and economic recession. The devastating human and financial legacy of the First World War had engendered a deep-seated cultural and political cynicism regarding foreign intervention, a sentiment fiercely crystallized by the "merchants of death" thesis. The Special Committee on Investigation of the Munitions Industry, commonly known as the Nye Committee, conducted exhaustive and high-profile hearings throughout the mid-1930s. The committee's central finding, that American intervention in the Great War had been predicated not on the defense of democratic principles, but fundamentally upon the pecuniary interests of munitions manufacturers and financiers seeking to safeguard Allied loans, served to delegitimize any future consideration of foreign entanglements. This widely accepted conviction fostered a pervasive public desire for stringent legal safeguards designed to prevent future presidential overreach and commitment to European conflict, viewing political action as inherently susceptible to capitalist manipulation and wartime profiteering. The political strength of the isolationist bloc transcended traditional party lines, uniting fiscal conservatives who feared government spending with pacifists who feared bloodshed, forming a formidable and often impregnable legislative coalition against interventionist policies. The considerable potency of this isolationist fervor was dramatically exemplified by the near ratification of the Ludlow Amendment in 1938. This proposed constitutional amendment sought to mandate a national public referendum prior to any congressional declaration of war, save only in the highly limited case of a direct invasion of the United States territories. The proposed measure was viewed by many as the ultimate legislative safeguard against being manipulated into a foreign conflict, asserting direct popular control over foreign policy commitments. Its defeat in the House of Representatives by the minuscule margin of 209 to 188 underscored the pervasive legislative paralysis governing foreign policy. A marginal shift of merely 11 votes would have fundamentally abrogated the constitutional war powers of the federal government in the face of a rapidly escalating global crisis. Consequently, the Neutrality Acts enacted between 1935 and 1937 imposed a rigid, comprehensive embargo on the sale of armaments and the extension of loans to all belligerents. This legislative straitjacket, while explicitly intended to insulate the nation from conflict, inadvertently created a structural advantage for established aggressor nations possessing pre-existing stockpiles and superior manufacturing capabilities, while critically penalizing those victim nations dependent upon imported materiel. The requirement for strictly enforced impartiality meant that American foreign policy was dictated more by reactive domestic sentiment than by proactive global realpolitik, establishing a profound ethical dilemma for the executive branch by forcing adherence to laws that demonstrably favored the expansion of totalitarian regimes, a consequence often acknowledged by critics of the acts. The ideological basis of these acts privileged American detachment over global stability, mistakenly believing that economic disconnection could ensure physical security. The political cost of challenging these foundational isolationist principles severely restricted the Roosevelt administration's diplomatic options until external events rendered them indefensible. The initial inability to sell arms to the Allies also inadvertently constrained the growth of the very defense production base the U.S. would later desperately need. The political and cultural power of this isolationist consensus effectively bound the entire nation to a course of inaction that directly contradicted its geopolitical interests. The commencement of the European conflict with the invasion of Poland in September 1939 necessitated an immediate, albeit delicate, recalibration of this rigid statutory framework. The Roosevelt administration, cognizant that the comprehensive arms embargo inherently disadvantaged the Allied powers, whose command of the Atlantic sea lanes provided indispensable access to American markets, orchestrated a challenging revision of the Neutrality Acts. The resulting cash and carry provision of November 1939 permitted the sale of materiel to belligerents strictly contingent upon immediate payment in hard currency, specifically gold, and transport conducted exclusively on non-American vessels. While the policy was carefully presented as nominally neutral and intended to preserve American commercial rights while reducing the risk of maritime incidents, it effectively facilitated the transfer of American industrial output to Great Britain and France, decisively aligning American economic power with the Allied cause and initiating the rapid depletion of Allied financial reserves. The operational requirement for cash up front meant the Allies were essentially mortgaging their global assets immediately upon placing an order in the United States, placing immense strain on the British imperial economy, particularly as orders for aircraft began to multiply rapidly and exceed available domestic production capacity. Following the deceptive calm of the Phony War, Sitzkrieg, a peculiar period lasting nearly 7 months, during which American public opinion mistakenly concluded that European hostilities might subside into a stalemate, the rapid and devastating capitulation of France in June 1940 fundamentally shattered the prevailing American strategic paradigm. Defense planners had axiomatically relied upon the complementary roles of the Royal Navy and the formidable French army as impregnable bulwarks against continental aggression. The sudden removal of the French check on German expansion, coupled with the loss of France's significant industrial capacity and Atlantic strategic ports, raised the immediate and existential threat of a Nazi hegemony over the entirety of Europe, and a subsequent direct threat to the Western Hemisphere via the Atlantic. The subsequent formation of the collaborationist Vichy French regime further complicated matters, as French colonial assets and the remaining French fleet became strategic points of contention, requiring the U.S. to engage in complex diplomatic and military efforts to prevent the fleet from falling under German control, culminating in the seizure of French ships in U.S. ports. This profound geopolitical shock prompted the unanimous congressional enactment of the Two-Ocean Navy Act in July 1940, authorizing an enormous 70% expansion in naval shipbuilding, the largest single naval procurement bill in national history, to ensure simultaneous defense capabilities in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The strategic goal shifted decisively from merely enforcing neutrality to preparing for a potential two-front war, consistent with the evolving Plan Dog strategy of prioritizing the defense of the Western Hemisphere while focusing offensive efforts against Germany. Concurrently, domestic anxiety regarding internal subversion, the so-called Fifth Column scare, amplified by pro-Axis elements, resulted in the passage of the Alien Registration Act, Smith Act, which mandated the fingerprinting and registration of millions of non-citizens, reflecting a severe deterioration of domestic trust and the government's perceived need for preemptive security measures. By September 1940, the strategic imperative to sustain Great Britain, which now stood alone as the sole remaining combatant against Germany in the West, necessitated the immediate transfer of vital naval assets, specifically 50 obsolete destroyers required for critical convoy escort duties against U-boat attacks. However, the existing legislative framework severely restricted the transfer of military vessels. To circumvent the constraints of the Walsh Amendment, which prohibited the disposal of naval equipment certified as useful for defense, and the Espionage Act of 1917, and further, to avoid the protracted political peril of seeking Senate ratification, Attorney General Robert Jackson formulated a complex and highly controversial legal opinion. This legal formulation characterized the transfer of 50 obsolete Wicks and Clemson-class destroyers not as a gift or sale, but as a reciprocal strategic exchange of potentially unequal value. Jackson's argument relied heavily on a loose interpretation of disposal, asserting that an exchange was not equivalent to a sale or transfer to a belligerent, thereby skirting the constitutional requirement for a two-thirds treaty vote in the Senate and exploiting the ambiguity between wartime sales and peacetime exchanges. In return for these vessels, characterized derisively as four-stackers and notorious for their cold, wet, poor handling and obsolescent design, the United States secured 99-year rent-free leases on critical British bases extending from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, thereby closing the naval air defense gap in the Western Atlantic. Jackson's sophisticated argument rested on the premise that the acquisition of these bases constituted a net gain in overall American defensive capability, thus legally permitting the executive to determine the vessels were not essential for current U.S. defense under the terms of the Walsh Amendment. This pivotal transaction, executed solely via executive agreement, effectively extended the American defensive perimeter thousands of miles eastward into the Atlantic. This maneuver, deemed constitutional brinkmanship by detractors and vehemently opposed by isolationists, marked a definitive and material departure from traditional neutrality under the politically palatable guise of hemispheric defense, unequivocally signaling the administration's resolve to utilize unilateral executive power to bypass isolationist legislative roadblocks. The successful execution of this agreement provided the template for future non-neutral assistance. The geopolitical consequence was the establishment of American military presence in British territories, laying the groundwork for post-war Anglo-American strategic cooperation and the gradual reconfiguration of the British Empire's defense infrastructure. The British receipt of the destroyers, though outdated, immediately freed up more modern Royal Navy vessels for deployment closer to home defense duties in the English Channel, addressing the immediate crisis of convoy losses. The presidential election of 1940 functioned as a de facto national referendum on the interventionist trajectory of the administration, complicated intensely by the unprecedented constitutional question of a third presidential term. The political discourse was violently polarized between the interventionist Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies and the powerful isolationist America First Committee, the latter of which garnered significant support from prominent figures across business, aviation, and public life. The Republican nomination of Wendell Willkie, an internationalist corporate lawyer who had never held public office, at the Philadelphia Convention, an event frequently termed the Miracle of Philadelphia due to the dramatic, spontaneous nature of his grassroots nomination, fueled in part by anti-Taft and anti-New Deal sentiment, proved strategically fortuitous for Roosevelt. Willkie's eventual support for aid to Britain precluded the election from becoming a clear referendum on the isolationist versus interventionist divide, allowing Roosevelt to focus on the stability of his leadership rather than the policy itself, thereby forcing both major parties into an awkward, though vital, consensus regarding Allied material support. Conversely, the Democratic National Convention was characterized by orchestrated acclamation and highly contentious internal maneuvering designed to overcome the powerful anti-third-term tradition established by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. The proceedings were heavily influenced by the "Voice from the Sewer" incident, in which political operative Thomas Gary, stationed in the Chicago Coliseum basement, utilized a microphone connected to the public address system to initiate deafening and prolonged chants of "We want Roosevelt," until the exhausted delegates were successfully stampeded into renominating the incumbent. The administration simultaneously used political rhetoric to mock the isolationist opposition, frequently attacking the key Republican leaders as Martin, Barton, and Fish, a chant that quickly became a campaign shorthand for Republican obstructionism. Nevertheless, the acute political necessity of neutralizing the isolationist threat compelled President Roosevelt to issue firm assurances against foreign deployment, famously stating to the electorate in Boston, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars," a pledge subjected to intense and valid scrutiny for its deliberate, yet ultimately unfulfilled, political expediency, given the covert strategic planning already underway. Simultaneously with these political maneuvers, the administration secured the passage of the Burke-Wadsworth Act, establishing the first peacetime conscription in the national history. This act immediately brought reluctant civilian manpower into the ill-equipped military structure, initiating a necessary but deeply unpopular societal transition. The profound fragility of congressional support for this measure was most acutely evidenced in the summer of 1941, when the legislation to extend the draft term beyond the initial statutory 12 months passed the House of Representatives by the infinitesimal and astonishing margin of a single vote, 203 to 202. Failure to secure this single vote extension would have resulted in the mass discharge and de facto disbandment of the mobilized Army force mere months prior to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, demonstrating the extreme and chilling precariousness of the nation's defensive posture during that period. The morale within the newly formed training camps was correspondingly perilous due to the sudden disruption of civilian life and the inadequate pay structure. Dissent within the ranks manifested in the Ohio movement, Over the Hill in October, wherein draftees threatened mass desertion upon the completion of their original 12-month service obligation. This unrest, a near mutiny of citizen soldiers, was fundamentally exacerbated by the significant disparity between the meager military pay, $21 per month, and the rapidly rising wages available in the newly established, lucrative defense industries, highlighting the profound social and economic friction caused by the nation's accelerating, yet partial, mobilization efforts. The draftees, often disparagingly referred to as $3-a-day men, resented the high wages and perceived security of the $4-a-day factory workers, creating an internal division between the military and the civilian production sectors. The dramatic blindfolded lottery drawing conducted by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, utilizing the same cobalt blue fishbowl from World War I, served as a potent, if archaic, piece of political theater intended to sanctify the necessity of the draft extension and publicly legitimize the retention of military personnel, despite the evident internal resistance and strain on the all-volunteer National Guard units, which also faced extended service. By late 1940, British financial reserves had been entirely depleted by the strict requirements of the cash-and-carry policy, demanding gold or hard currency for all materiel purchases. This critical exhaustion of liquid assets prompted an economic crisis for the British war effort, which directly jeopardized the anti-Axis coalition. To neutralize persistent isolationist skepticism regarding British insolvency and to satisfy the stringent demands of American financial institutions and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, the United States government compelled the comprehensive and humiliating liquidation of British overseas assets. This process included the notorious forced sale of the American Viscose Corporation, a massive rayon and textile manufacturer valued at over $100 million, to a banking syndicate led by Morgan Stanley for a mere fraction of its actual valuation. The operation was publicly framed as a demonstration to Congress and Wall Street that Britain had exhausted its own tangible resources, having sold the family silver, thereby justifying necessary American financial intervention. The political necessity of this humiliating step underscored the harsh transactional realities of American assistance, ensuring that no future debt issue could parallel the unpaid loans of World War I. To ensure the continued and uninterrupted flow of armaments after British liquidity was definitively exhausted, the revolutionary Lend-Lease policy, House Resolution 1776, was conceived as a non-repayable alternative to loans or gifts, thereby sidestepping the sensitive issue of war debts left over from the First World War. Rhetorically, the policy was masterfully framed by the president using the famous garden hose analogy, positing that prudent neighbors lend vital equipment during a crisis to prevent the conflagration from spreading, thereby shifting the core public debate from commerce and debt to collective hemispheric security. House Resolution 1776 empowered the executive branch to unilaterally transfer defense articles through sale, exchange, lease, or loan to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to the security of the United States. This unprecedented delegation of executive discretion was monumental, fundamentally recasting the president's role in foreign policy and global allocation of resources. Despite fierce legislative opposition, epitomized by Senator Burton Wheeler's bitterly graphic characterization of the policy as one that would plow under every fourth American boy, the act was decisively passed in March 1941, definitively ending the pretense of American neutrality. The total initial appropriation was $7 billion, an astronomical sum surpassing the entire federal budget of 1917, signaling the absolute and immediate scale of the nation's commitment to industrial warfare. The policy's structure established the United States as the global economic power capable of unilaterally sustaining a multi-front conflict, a role formalized in the post-war international order. The systematic implementation of these policies required a massive and chaotic national industrial conversion, commonly referred to as the Battle of the Potomac, due to the constant bureaucratic and political infighting among competing governmental and private interests. To manage the logistics of this unprecedented undertaking, the administration utilized the expertise of dollar-a-year men, executives recruited from the private sector who worked for the government for a nominal salary while retaining their corporate pay. These individuals often faced legitimate accusations of corporate bias and conflicts of interest, as their corporate loyalties sometimes clashed with governmental production priorities, particularly concerning the necessary abandonment of civilian automotive production. To mitigate the substantial financial risks associated with converting civilian production lines to military output, the government instituted cost-plus contracts, guaranteeing manufacturers reimbursement for all incurred costs, plus a fixed, guaranteed profit margin. This mechanism proved essential for overcoming the initial resistance from the powerful automotive industry to abandon lucrative civilian production and dedicate capacity entirely to materiel output. Internal friction between labor and capital was illustrated sharply by the innovative proposal and subsequent initial rejection and ultimate adoption of the Reuther Plan, advanced by UAW leader Walter Reuther. The plan argued for the immediate and efficient utilization of excess automotive manufacturing capacity for mass aircraft production, which was initially dismissed by automotive executives due to concerns over complex technical tolerances and disruption to existing profit structures. The eventual success of industrial facilities like Willow Run, which produced B-24 bombers on an automobile-style assembly line, vindicated Reuther's core concept, establishing a template for standardized, mass wartime manufacturing. Concurrently, the mobilization of American science was formalized under the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, led by Vannevar Bush. This agency was deliberately structured to bypass traditional military procurement and development bureaucracy, allowing a rapid, centralized effort to accelerate the development of critical war technologies, including microwave radar, the proximity fuse, and the early foundational stages of the atomic weapon program, the genesis of the Manhattan Project. The NDRC's immediate establishment following the fall of France underscored the executive branch's acute recognition that technological superiority would be indispensable to any future victory, regardless of the nation's slow initial military buildup. The institutionalization of the NDRC permanently altered the relationship between the federal government and scientific research in the United States, creating the public-private partnership model that would dominate post-war technological development. On the intelligence and influence front, the British Security Coordination, BSC, operating covertly out of Rockefeller Center with the tacit approval of the President and overseen by William Stevenson, intrepid, waged a sophisticated influence campaign to consolidate American support. These operations included the fabrication of intelligence maps, such as the one revealed by Roosevelt to suggest Nazi plans for South America, designed to terrify the public and discredit the isolationist political bloc in Congress. Furthermore, the powerful and immediate radio broadcasts of Edward R. Murrow from London rooftops during the Blitz provided a visceral, auditory connection between the American public and the suffering of the Allied nation, significantly eroding isolationist sentiment and softening the ground for intervention. Finally, by March 1941, the final legislative and strategic vestiges of neutrality had been supplanted by an explicit and actionable commitment to global war mobilization. The culmination of this transformation was codified in the secret ABC-1 staff talks, confidential meetings between British and American military planners in Washington, D.C., reaching a formal, albeit confidential, agreement on a Germany-first grand strategy in the event of war, meaning that 70% of American effort would be directed toward the defeat of Germany, even if Japan initiated hostilities against the United States. This strategic consensus, achieved 9 months prior to Pearl Harbor, demonstrated the true non-neutral status of the United States. The cumulative effect of these legislative, financial, industrial, and strategic measures, ranging from the narrow victory of the draft extension to the unprecedented scientific and industrial mobilization, rendered the United States a full belligerent in global conflict, defined not by a formal declaration of war, but by the sheer scale and irreversible nature of its material and strategic commitment to the Allied cause. The passage of Lend-Lease effectively transformed the United States from a debtor nation following World War I into the dominant creditor and industrial supplier to the free world, permanently institutionalizing the nation's global economic and military supremacy and setting the conditions for its emergence as a global superpower.